The issue here tonight is economic crisis, and the argument I would make is that if you want to understand economic crisis, neoclassical mainstream economic theory is not going to do you much good. And if you follow the economic issues, you know that many people who presumably were the economic experts in the universities and economics departments, very few of them were writing about the coming crisis. But Marxists were writing about the coming crisis. Now, this is not necessarily a shock to anyone. I mean, the joke about Marxism is that Marxism has predicted 15 of the last 3 crises. We always see a crisis brewing. We regard it and we assume that it's a natural part of capitalism. We'll talk more about that. In terms of the title, notice I say a Marxist, a neo-Marxist perspective, not the neo-Marxist perspective. So what I'm telling you, as I always tell my students, is you're going to get a particular perspective. It's not the only perspective, which is what the economists often say to their students when they take an economics course. This is economics, you don't need to know anything else. But even within Marxism, there are different crisis theories. So there's the crisis theory of the falling rate of profit. There's a crisis theory about long waves, what are called Kondratiev cycles. There's a Marxist theory that is focused on stagnation tendencies in capitalism. And then there's something called a kind of underconsumptionist theory of crisis in Marxism. So within Marxism, there are multiple theories of crisis. And what do Marxists do? Even though they say the common enemy is the bourgeoisie, they attack each other over who's right about what Marx said, what he meant, and which theory is correct. Now, this is a group that isn't into dogma, correct?
Correct.
Right. So I'm not going to be dogmatic about Marxism. I'm telling you that I'm presenting one particular Marxist theory of crisis that I find to be quite useful, interesting, insightful, and it's accessible. It does not require any technical mathematical skills. You don't need to know the theory of the theory of surplus labor. You don't need to know a lot of the technical aspects of Marxist theory. Okay, so let's get started. Let me make a few points about what all Marxist theories of crisis assume. The first assumption is that the economy is a political institution. Okay? Now, in neoclassical economics, it's not described as a political institution. It's a place where markets perform efficiently in a self-correcting way. In Marxist theory, there's a fundamental antagonism built into the economy, the way the economy is organized, and the positions that people occupy in the economy, and that produces conflict, class conflict, social class conflict. So the economic arena is a political arena. The conflict is between 2 classes, and these are the classes we'll talk about. Yes, the class system is much more complex than 2, but in terms of analytical precision for this crisis theory, we talk about 2 classes, labor and capital. They compete, they engage in conflict with each other. It's an antagonistic class relationship in the economy, and this spills over into the political system. So even though capital and labor compete and are engaged in conflict in the economic institutions, they often turn to the political institutions to intervene on their behalf through particular kinds of policies. Second, capitalist crisis is not an anomaly. The crisis we're in, the crises of capitalism generally, are not anomalies. They're not errors. They're not mistakes. They are a fundamental part of the way capitalism operates. Capitalism as an economic system generates its own crises systemically. Okay. So it's not an anomaly we're having this crisis, it's an expectation of the way capitalism works. Third, the way we resolve and get out of one economic crisis tends to plant the seeds for the next crisis. And we'll see how this works as I apply the model. So you have the Great Depression, you have a set of policies put in place to try to get us out of the Great Depression. How did those policies contribute to the next economic crisis of the 1970s and 1980s? How did the policies that were then instituted to get us out of the 70s and 80s contribute to the current crisis we're in now? That is what I want to lay out using a particular theory of crisis, a particular Marxist theory of crisis. Okay. In this theory of crisis, a few assumptions. All economic theories make assumptions, all right? One is there are two necessary conditions for capitalist expansion, capitalist growth, or what Marxists call capital accumulation. Two necessary conditions. The first condition is what we call the capacity to produce. That is, conditions must exist in the economy that encourage and stimulate private capitalists to invest their money. That is, conditions have to be such that capitalists anticipate that investment will produce a profitable return. The capacity to produce. Okay? That's one condition. If capitalists do not believe that conditions are ripe, that they're profitable, they will not invest their money. There will be no capitalist growth. There will be no expansion. There will be no employment. So you have to have in place the capacity to produce. Second, you have to have a capacity to consume. And what this means is that not only is there capacity for capitals to invest their money and receive a return, but you have to have a sufficient amount of demand by the population with money, effective demand we call it, that will purchase the goods that are being produced. So you need conditions that ensure investment to supply the goods, and you need conditions to ensure that the goods are sold. Okay? Now, where does the contradiction lie here? Of course, this is Marxist theory, so contradictions lie everywhere. All right? But the contradiction here, when we talk about these two capacities, can be seen at the level of wages. If you're a capitalist and you want to invest and you want to maximize your profits, do you want wages to be high or low? Low as possible. Slave labor would be the ideal. Okay? Where would you want wages to be in order to make sure you have a capacity to consume?
High.
High. Herein lies a contradiction. Okay? Every capitalist, ideally, this is what they would like. They would like to have slave workers. But they would want every other capitalist to pay their workers a lot. Make sense? Right? You're producing cheap. You're going to make a high profit when you sell the goods to the people who are getting paid well by the other capitalists. Beautiful arrangement. Think about this contradiction in the case of globalization, where you want production to be done at the lowest possible wage, but you have to sell the goods. So, in globalization, we produce the goods in one location, where wages can be super low, and we sell the goods in a different geographic location where people have more money to spend. Okay? So it's interesting to think about this contradiction in terms of globalization. We'll talk a little more about that. Okay, so have to have a capacity to produce, capacity to consume, necessary conditions for capitalist accumulation and expansion. That's the bedrock set of assumptions in this model, in this theory of crisis. Two different kinds of crisis under capitalism. One is what we call a demand-side crisis. A demand-side crisis occurs when I say capital, okay, I'm talking about the capitalist class, okay, as a whole, capital. When I'm talking about labor, I'm talking about the working class as a whole, okay? Workers, capitalists, proletariat, bourgeoisie, capital, labor, okay? This is the terminology, right? So when capitalists are very strong, and they're getting their way, and they're keeping costs as low as possible, and they're keeping wages as low as possible, you have what's called a demand-side crisis. Does that make sense? A demand-side crisis because wages are very low. And so you might have production, but you may not have sufficient consumption. So I just expressed that in a more mathematical way, that the capacity to produce is stronger, is greater, is larger, is more powerful than the capacity to consume. So when capitalists are strong, when they're asserting their power, when they're getting their way, you tend to have, over time, a demand-side crisis. We sometimes call this wage squeeze. Okay? So sometimes when people describe this particular Marxist theory, they call it a profit squeeze and wage squeeze model. Okay? Different terms for the same theory. A supply-side crisis occurs when labor tends to be strong. Notice I say when labor is strong. I never say when labor is too strong. Because from my view, labor can never be too strong. And in fact, labor is structurally at a disadvantage in capitalism all the time anyway, by virtue of the fact that they must sell their wage. They must sell their labor for a wage to a capitalist. That's the structural fact about capitalism. And therefore, they're always at a structural disadvantage. But when labor is relatively strong and relatively powerful and organized and wages go up, this eats into profit. And then you have what's called a supply-side crisis, because capitalists are less willing to invest when wages are going up, when wages are high, when costs are high. Okay? So we sometimes call this the profit squeeze. And I express that as the capacity to consume exceeds the capacity to produce. So these are the two kinds of crises that may occur, depending on the relative power and the relative strength of labor and capital. So let's go through some of the crises to take us to the current day, what kind of crisis we have today. The economic crisis of the 1930s, within this framework, within this model, is regarded as a demand-side crisis. That's because in the 1920s, capital was very strong. Labor unions had not yet organized themselves completely. There was large amounts of immigrant labor, so there was surplus labor. This was the beginning and the introduction of new technologies of production, and particularly the assembly line in mass production. So capital was very strong in the 1920s. They anticipated high profits. They were investing. There was speculation. There was the anticipation that they would get high returns on their investment, given the low cost, particularly of labor. So the capacity to produce was much stronger than the capacity to consume. But the problem was enormous amounts of money were invested, anticipating a profit. The problem is there was insufficient demand. Wages were too low. And so speculation, investment in the stock market, you produce the goods, those goods have been produced cheaply because wages are low. But you don't realize the profit until you sell them. And the only way you can sell them is when consumers buy them using wages, using money. Okay? So you stunted wages, and therefore you have what's called a demand-side crisis. A demand-side crisis because there is insufficient demand. So by the way, economists are still arguing about the causes of the Great Depression. Okay? This is a stylized, very short, ultra-simplistic analysis but I want to place each one of the crises of US capitalism within the context of this model. So this was a demand-side crisis, which required a demand-side solution. What was that solution? Well, if you know your history, and you remember the period of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, what kind of policies were instituted? They were instituted as a way to pump money into the system, to pump money into the economy, to expand government, to do things for workers. So you have what we call Keynesian economic policy. When you hear this phrase, he's a Keynesian economist. He's proposing Keynesian policies. That means you're proposing a certain kind of fiscal policy that stimulates the economy by government spending, okay? And government hiring workers. So during this period, we can go on and talk about all of these policies and programs that were instituted, some of them still here today, but always under a threat by the capitalist class. I didn't like this shit, okay? They didn't like any of this, but they agreed to it. They agreed to it because at that time, FDR was able to tell them, these workers are very militant. There's lots of socialists. There's lots of communists. There's Trotskyites. There's every variety of radical you can imagine, and they're pissed off, and look what happened in the Soviet Union. Okay, all right. So we're going to institute some policy. They didn't like it, but they went along with it. Those policies cost a lot of money, and they were paid for by very high taxes. It's a different time. But one might ask, why don't we do this today? Good question. We'll get to that. Okay? So we had social insurance, more progressive taxation, redistribution. People say redistribution, that's what governments do. They redistribute money. In the last 30 years, there's been a lot of redistribution from the bottom up. Okay? This was redistribution from the top down to get demand pumped up, to get the economy going again. Unionization rights were developed during this period, during the New Deal, under all kinds of legislation. And of course, we had the beginning of the social welfare state, minimum wage, Social Security, etc. I put military Keynesianism in there because that is a concept that Marxists used. And many people say, well, we really never got out of it until the war. Yes, that's spending. That's government spending, pumping money into the economy. So if you look at the development of US capitalism from this point on, and particularly after World War II and the Cold War, it's what's called military Keynesianism. That is military spending stimulating the economy. I don't know how many of you follow Rick Scott. How many of you follow? How many of you like it? Okay, I didn't think this group would like it at all. Okay. Anyway, Rick Scott is always saying, we don't want any government. We don't want any government spending. We don't want federal spending. We reject it. We don't want it. But then they said they were going to cut military spending. And it was going to affect bases and jobs in Florida. And he took the time and the effort to argue directly and demand and write a letter to the president asking him, please spend money on the military. So, Rick Scott is a military Keynesianist. Okay? He doesn't like government. He doesn't like governments except in the military because it might stimulate this state economy. Right? Interesting. All right. I throw this in because I don't think this is all about economics. You actually have to change the way people think a little bit, the ideology, the culture, so that they actually think they need to be buying all the shit that they do, which we do in the United States. So you have to have a marketing industry, and you have to have advertising. And so this is one of the great books written many years ago. Okay, I'm getting old. I like to look back at these books. They had an impression on me. And this was one, Captains of Consciousness. And this book Still recommend it. It's about the development, the emergence of the advertising industry, and how, when you have a mass production economy that's beginning to develop in the 1920s, you also have to have mass consumption, and you have to create consumers. And you have to do that by infiltrating people's brains in terms of how they think about what matters, what's valuable, their identity, etc. And we know all this now, okay? But there was a time when thriftiness was a good thing. It was actually admirable not to spend money. Okay? Now you have to make excuses if you aren't profligate, right, with your cash. And in this current economic crisis, we actually have something called the paradox of thrift. The paradox of thrift. On the one hand, people have a lot of debt, so they shouldn't be spending money. Individually, that's a very rational decision, right? Collectively, it screws up the whole economy because people aren't spending money. Right? The paradox of thrift. It's like the capitalist who wants their workers to get nothing and everyone else's workers to get paid a lot. What is individually rational for the capitalist is to pay their workers nothing. What's collectively rational is for everyone to pay people enough money so that it stimulates the economy. That's another contradiction. Individual rationality of an individual capitalist, and then the collective rationality. Okay. Within this Marxist theory of crisis, we call these different strategies to get out of the crisis as social structures of accumulation. And if you look up any of these terms, you will get connected to the literature, okay? Range of Marxists that were involved in this. I did my graduate work at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I was studying sociology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, but I feel like Rubio. I was taking sociology, but I was interested in economics. As it turns out, the sociology department, the economics department at the University of Massachusetts is not in a business school. It's in the College of Arts and Sciences. And it's made up of a bunch of Marxists. Someone at UMass decided, there's a bunch of Marxists out there that can't find jobs. Why don't we bring them all here? Okay? And after all, it is the People's Republic of Massachusetts, right? Okay? So they brought them all there. Bowles, Gintis, Edwards, Wolf, Resnick, all these guys. Harvard degrees, right? They were Marxist economists. They were rejected by the other departments around the country. They all came to UMass. So I would sit in on their classes. That's really the only kind of education I got. And I didn't sit in on that many. I didn't have time, right? But it was an unbelievable place to have all of these Marxist economists located there and available to students in any discipline. All right. Social structure of accumulation is a concept that comes from a group of economists at UMass. So it reminded me of that. So they call this social structure of accumulation the capital-labor accord, right? So this is what we think of the post-war economic boom, okay? To this day, the most dynamic period of capitalism in our history, right? We talk about like 19, post-war, 45, maybe to the mid-70s. It's based on Keynesian theory, sometimes called a Fordist model. Okay, I won't go into that, but these terms are sometimes used interchangeably. And it's a non-zero sum logic, and that's very important. This has changed a lot. What is the non-zero sum logic? A zero-sum logic is the capital saying anything the worker gets is a cost to me, right? That's zero-sum logic, the zero-sum game. Anything that they get, I lose, right? So under that kind of mentality, you're not going to want to give people wage increases. But if you have a non-zero-sum logic that says higher wages will in turn produce greater demand, which will stimulate the economy, then wages are not a pure cost, they're a cost and a benefit. See? So that was, in some sense, the brilliance of the Keynesian solution, that wages could be both a cost and a benefit, right? But you have to think collectively, in a collectively rational way, to make that work. The hallmark of this period was that when productivity increased, and a lot of this had to do with union negotiated contracts, collective bargaining agreements, when productivity increased, wages would go up, okay? And capitalists were happy to pass on, with the productivity increases, higher wages to workers. And this was built into collective bargaining agreements. So this is what we do with the capital-labor accord, right? Capital and labor coming to some agreement about the nature and the relationship of this period of capitalism. The workers said, we're not going to ask to take control of the workplace, okay? That would be a truly socialist, or maybe even communist, okay? Let's just say socialist. And certainly a much more democratic arrangement if the workers actually control the workplace. They said, no, we're not going to do that as long as we get the wages commensurate with the productivity increases. And that was kind of a compromise, right? So you have this capital-labor agreement. Capital-labor accord. So I say this fueled the boom from about 50 to 73. Nixon was famous for saying this, okay? Because, he's a Republican, reluctantly. We're all Keynesians now, okay? We're all Keynesians now. We all believe in Keynesian economics. This is the paradigm. This is what's made the economy work. This is fine, okay? Well, we hit a crisis in the 1970s. So let's think about this. You've got all kinds of New Deal legislation. Unions are getting more powerful, they're getting stronger, you got the social welfare state, you got this, you got that, and this gets larger, more expansive, and capital begins to complain, okay? The capital-labor accord, it's not working for us. So they complain about high taxes. Taxes are too high. There's too many regulations, because you had a massive expansion of regulatory policy implemented during both the New Deal and beyond in the 50s and the 60s. You'd be amazed at what people were implementing in terms of regulatory policy in the 60s and the 70s. Then if you even tried to propose it now, you would be shot down as a job killer, right? And I'm talking about Richard Nixon, Clean Water, Clean Air Act, a Republican. You'd be drummed out of the party in a minute, okay? All right, things have changed a lot. So capital was complaining, taxes are too high, wages are too high, unions are too strong, the welfare state is too generous. They had that little phrase, free the Fortune 500, okay? Because they were being enslaved, right, by this expanding system. And they decided they were going to stop investing. So the crisis of the 1970s, okay, is a crisis that we call a supply-side crisis, right? Remember before the problem was there wasn't enough demand. People didn't have enough money to spend. They weren't buying the goods that were being produced. Now the problem is the capitalists don't want to invest, right? The capacity to produce. They don't want to invest because costs are too high. So you have what's called disinvestment. You have what's called an investment strike. This is a term that is often used to describe the behavior of capitalists when they don't like what the state is doing, when they don't like what the government is doing, when they think the government is moving in a social democratic or socialist direction. They engage in what's called a capital strike. They withdraw their capital. They stop investing. They move it out of the country. Now there's some debate about the profit squeeze, okay? This is the profit squeeze side of the equation. But clearly, the economy went into a tailspin in the 70s, and they weren't investing their money. Whether the profits were really being squeezed, or whether, as some Marxists argue, there was plenty of profit, they had plenty of capital, they simply wanted a higher return on investment of that capital, okay? So there's some interesting debates among Marxists about that point. But there's very little doubt it was an economic crisis. It was a last major economic crisis beginning in the mid-1970s, and it was largely based on disinvestment. Stagflation. Does anyone remember this term, stagflation? It's nice to have an older audience for a change. So, stagnation, inflation. Okay, these things are not supposed to go together. Okay? When the economy is slowing down, when it's going into recession, prices are supposed to drop. right? So this was a very strange thing that happened in the 1970s. And economists couldn't explain it. I mean, it was like dry water. I mean, these things aren't supposed to go together. Right? This is the Phillips curve. This is the only curve I'm going to show you, okay? I don't understand half these curves anyway, right? You don't need to understand these curves to understand the way the economy works. But this is sort of a classic relationship, right? It's a relationship between inflation and unemployment. And it's a fairly logical one. That is, when unemployment is low, right, workers have more bargaining power because labor is scarce. Demand for labor exceeds supply. Wages go up. You're in a stronger position to bargain, right? So you would expect inflation to start rising, right? So this is one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve is always worried about low unemployment, right? Because it might create these inflationary pressures. And when there's high levels of unemployment, the supply of labor exceeds the demand, the price goes down. Obviously, and this is in the current situation, when there's lots of workers out there that are unemployed, looking for work, you can be easily replaced. It's very hard to bargain under those conditions. So the problem was that you had unemployment rising, okay? And you would expect then inflation to go down. But at some point it seemed unemployment kept rising. And so I attached this little curve. But notice that the inflation rate stays the same, right? You got an unemployment rate here, you got an unemployment rate here, but the inflation rate is stable. Now there's lots of arguments about what caused stagflation. What is the Marxist interpretation of this? The Marxist interpretation of this is that what was keeping prices high, in spite of the high unemployment, was the fact that because of the expansion of the social welfare state, workers had an alternative to taking any crappy job that was out there. They could collect social insurance, social welfare, unemployment benefits. So they could stay out of the job market until it got better rather than being forced into the job market because they weren't getting any support from the government. Capitalists don't like this. Okay? What they want is as many people to be forced into the labor market as possible who can work. Right? Because the more workers you have, the more they're competing with each other, the lower wages are going to be. So this is called the social wage. The social wage, the wage that's provided to people for not working. I know this sounds very un-American, okay? So what you do is you have to resolve this problem, you have to go after the social welfare system, okay? So that people don't have any choice but to sell their labor power for a wage in the labor market. Monetarism. Remember we had Keynesianism? Monetarism. What's the difference between fiscal policy, which is Keynesian, monetary policy? Monetary policy involves manipulating the money supply by the Federal Reserve Bank. So, how do you squeeze inflation out of the system? You raise interest rates, and you send the economy into a recession, and you raise the unemployment rate so that you discipline workers. They can't rely any longer on the social welfare state because that was another part of the policy, and you engage in what we would call an austerity monetary policy. Anyone heard of Paul Volcker? Right? He's still around. I can't believe the guy's immortal, right? With the cigar. Paul Volcker was the Federal Reserve Chair in 1982, and he raised the interest rate higher than they have been ever since. He did it deliberately. They deliberately, under the Reagan administration, created a recession to tame inflation and beat the shit out of workers. Okay, by the way. It worked!
Is that when mortgage rates went up to 18%?
Yes, exactly. But this is the medicine you have to swallow to get the economy back in equilibrium. Okay? All right, so how do you resolve a supply-side crisis? SupplySide Economics. Do you remember that? It's still the ideology. Okay? introduced Reaganomics, voodoo economics. Remember the person who used that term? Bush won. That's right, Bush won, called it voodoo economics. Then he became president and he proposed the same thing. They called that deja voodoo. That's the best line I have, I'm telling you right now. And I stole it. Okay. So what do we call this new social structure of accumulation? Neoliberalism. You've heard this term, okay? Lots of terms to describe this. A whole new set of economic principles and economic ideology, right? Market fundamentalism. What does that mean? That the market is ultimately the solution to everything. Okay, that's a double meaning. And it's like a religious belief. It's faith-based economics. The market is good, the government is bad. The market solves all problems, the government creates all problems. Market fundamentalism. Market first and foremost, and a religious belief in the sanctity of the market. Trickle-down economics. So the logic here was, we need to encourage capitalists to invest their money. How are we going to do that? We need to cut taxes. We need to go after unions. We need to make wages lower. We need to cut regulations. We need to stimulate investment. That's what supply-side economics is. Supply-side economics is based on the assumption that if you give capital everything they want, they will invest massive amounts of money, we will all benefit, and even though there might be some concentration at the beginning, it will eventually trickle down. Or a rising tide, growth, lifts all boats. We all know what bullshit that was, okay? It didn't happen. But if you look at the arguments about economic policy, at the state level, at the local level, they're arguing the same thing. Things haven't changed that much. All right, so what does neoliberalism involve? Okay, cutting taxes on the rich business, right? Taxes were too high, cut them. The capitalists need taxes lower if they're going to invest. Eliminate regulations. Regulations are costly, they get in the way, they create inefficiencies, remove them. This is the stuff they learned in the neoclassical economics classes, okay? Labor unions create market imperfections, okay? They use the language of neoclassic. They're not good, okay? It's like an antitrust sort of thing. Forget about the fact that capital is monopolies, you know, but labor, antitrust. Attacking and gutting the welfare state, forcing more workers into the labor market, right? That was trying to get at that stagflation problem. Let capital go where it wants. Let it be much more mobile, okay? Privatization, okay? People are familiar with this. Deregulation, privatization, outsourcing, all of this was part of the economic gospel of neoliberalism. One economic geographer, David Harvey, I'll touch on this a little more in a moment, talks about a spatial fix, and that is another way to get out of this crisis. Another strategy that was used by capital was to use space, use geography, begin to think about locating jobs and production in different places. He called that a spatial fix. Outsourcing offshore. We all know about this, right? So what happened? Anyone familiar with Francis Fox Piven? Piven and Cloward? I think it was Glenn Beck that had some kind of, he started attacking this woman, and I don't know what happened. Anyway, okay. She's been around for a long time. She's a sociologist. So what I do is I like to show these book covers because they give you a sense of what people are thinking at the time, right? So this book came out in about 1982, The New Class War, okay? This was a class war. Forget about the capital-labor accord. Forget about sitting down with labor and trying to work out a new agreement. This was, we're going after labor and we're going to win, okay? Because we can, because we're powerful, because we have a set of ideas that the American public, very gullible sometimes, believes, right? Reagan's attack on the welfare state and its consequences. So this is about why did they go after the welfare state? They wanted workers to have no alternative but to work, no matter how low the wages, forcing more people into the labor market. A great book. Francis Fox Piven is still around. I think Richard Clower died. They wrote some great sociological works. Here's another way to think about it. This is David Harvey. He's an economic geographer. Neoliberalism, or he says neoliberalization, was from the very beginning a project to achieve the restoration of class power. Remember, we talked about the imbalance, capacity to produce, capacity to consume, capital too strong, labor got too strong. Okay? Project to achieve the restoration of class power, a political project to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elite. So this is the Marxist interpretation of the policies that were instituted in response to the crisis in the 1970s.
Is it an anti-New Deal?
It's an anti-New Deal, absolutely, yes. And that continues to this day. Because there are still remnants like the Social Security program, right? Always under attack. Doesn't matter what the president is, by the way. Okay. Forget about the Democrats, they're all neoliberals. Okay? They're all neoliberals. All right, so what else happened? Okay, this is all familiar. This was a classic book that was written in the early to mid 1980s, the deindustrialization of America, the hollowing out of America, the exodus of manufacturing jobs, first from the Northeast and the Midwest down to the South, and then out of the country. Okay, Bluestone and Harrison, classic work. Unionization rates sharply decline, particularly when you're moving manufacturing out of the United States. That was a union stronghold. You have a steady decline in the percentage of the population that is a union member. Tax regressivity. Now take a look at this. This is very interesting. This is the rate for the top bracket from 1912 to 2008. It was once 94%. And we weren't dead. Okay? We actually were doing pretty damn well. Okay? And it was 91% in 1960. Could you imagine, as a politician, getting up and proposing that the top tax rate be 91%? You can't get it from 35 to 45. What did it go up, like 4 percentage points? And only for those that make over 450,000. And that was like a huge struggle.
I think in England it was 125%.
It's 125%. I'm not sure how they calculate that, but that's a high rate. But remember, this is on a certain amount of income above a certain point, okay? Not on all your income, right? So, but take a look at this. So this goes up steadily during the New Deal period. You got to pay for these programs, right? Capitalists swallowed it, okay? Maybe they thought it was a good idea. Maybe they were afraid of the communists. Who knows what, okay? And then you see, where's 1980? Right there, okay? Goes down. Just steady, 35%, okay? So, cutting taxes across the board. Because supply-side economics is cutting taxes. Taxes are an imposition, they discourage investment, they discourage saving, et cetera, and cut taxes as low as possible, particularly on the rich, okay? By the way, when they raised that percentage recently, okay, from, what was it, 35, now it's 39?
39.
They reinstituted the payroll tax. Nobody talked about that, okay? Talk about regressive. So if you look at the percentage of the average worker's income that was affected by the tax changes, it was working people that got hit on that, not the rich. 4 percentage points higher, that was negligible. And Obama didn't want to talk about that, because he signed on to that one. I think most people know that income inequality has steadily increased from 1980. Every time we get the latest unemployment, every time we get the latest income inequality figures, there are reams and reams. If anyone's interested, I have slide after slide after slide after slide of income distribution, slicing it, dicing it, no matter how you look at it. Every time they report the data, it's a record high. And that is since 2007. Nothing has changed. Okay, so these are the things that are happening during this period, right? The 80s, the 90s. Globalization is a big part of the story here. We could spend a lot of time talking about it. I throw up some terms here just to describe what it all means. The spatial fix, a solution, using geography, using the globe, using the fact that there are differences, wage rates, environmental standards, etc., across countries. So we have massive capital mobility. The term wage arbitrage is what capital engages in, wage arbitrage. Basically, it means that there are sharp wage differences between two geographic locations, and you use the low wages that exist here as a way to undercut the wages here. Okay? And of course, capitalists have been doing that for a long time. We can't compete. The wages are too high. We can move our facility somewhere else, or you can take a pay cut, and you can give up some of those benefits. And of course, workers have been doing this consistently, union or otherwise, for many years. So what I say is we are all neoliberals now. No one has said that, but that's what I say. They're all neoliberals now. Everyone is bought in more or less to this economic philosophy. If you think it matters between Democrats and Republicans, it really doesn't, significantly. Clinton instituted some of the most draconian kinds of neoliberal policies. One was NAFTA, okay? North American Free Trade Agreement. Do you remember the big debate about that and how it was going to benefit us and benefit Mexico, and we were going to massively increase our exports, et cetera, et cetera? Read the data. It didn't happen, okay? Unions were against this. Labor was against this. Progressives were against this. Clinton was behind this 100%. He also instituted the welfare reform, if you remember, okay? That further cut the safety net, which was already tattered after the Reagan years. During this period, you have an increase in what we call unshared prosperity. Remember the capital labor accord. When there's growth, when there's profits, it's shared with labor. So here you have in blue, you've got the productivity rates and the changes over time in the real hourly compensation. 47 to 73, pretty close. 73 to 79, not as close as here. As you move in this direction, the differences become larger. That is, the productivity increases that were occurring in the economy were not passed on to the workers who are responsible for actually carrying out the labor that contributed to those productivity increases. Here's another way to look at it. Again, there's thousands of these charts available. This line at the bottom is the average overall wages. If you didn't know this, they've been flat since 1980. Absolutely flat. In fact, median income today is probably a little less than it was inflation adjusted. Okay? This is the productivity. Look at the gap between productivity and wages. And of course, this is the average income of the 1%, not the 99%. So again, unshared prosperity. So think about this. Capital is really strong. They're keeping wages really low. They're amassing high profits. They're taking all of the gains from productivity. You would expect this to produce a serious demand-side crisis. Workers don't have money. They've been deprived. The prosperity hasn't been shared. So, of course, the Marxists are saying the crisis is around the corner. Crisis is around the corner. Crisis is around the corner. Capital is very resilient, okay? Interesting things happen. How does the average worker keep up? One thing they do is they start working longer hours or more than one job. And so you get this book, a classic by Juliet Schor, who got her degree, by the way, at UMass Amherst, okay? The Overworked American. She talks about this. Why is it that we're the most advanced industrial country in the world and our workers work so much harder than 15, 20, or 30 other countries? Still today, the same thing, maybe even worse than when she was looking at it. More people enter the labor market. That is, all adults out working, often involuntarily. They don't want to work, they have to work to keep up, to make ends meet, or to consume the things that they believe they should be consuming to have a middle-class lifestyle, whatever you want to call it. By the way, Elizabeth Warren. Anyone know Elizabeth Warren? You know about Elizabeth Warren. Yes, Elizabeth Warren, okay? Just elected senator of Massachusetts, one of maybe 2 or 3 Democrats that has a spine, that gets up and asks tough questions. Because she's been studying this stuff for a long time, okay? She's excellent, okay? Two-income trap. This is the most important source of how the crisis was averted for so long. Debt. Credit card debt, and then home equity lines of credit that you could take out because the value of your home was rising and rising and rising and rising. Homes were the ATM machine of this period. So we averted the crisis. That is, there was demand, right? There was demand, but it was debt-based demand. It's artificial. And of course, the bill can't do, as we know. Consumer debt service ratio, you just have to look at the direction to see what's happening, okay? People take on increasingly heavy levels of debt to keep up because wages aren't keeping up with productivity, the cost of living. So, capital has all this profit based on these years of the neoliberal system, beginning in the 80s, through the 90s, into the 2000s. Okay. So on the one hand, the two problems are, who's going to buy the stuff if they're not getting paid enough? Okay, we saw the answer to that question. Overwork, multiple breadwinners, and then you have enormous amounts of debt. Then the next question is, where are they investing all the money that they have, the capitalists? Because they sure as hell ain't investing it in jobs, and they're not investing it in a new industry, not here. And of course, that's the other side, financialization. The capitalists need to find an outlet for their surplus, and they want an outlet that pays a high return. And so you have massive and massive amounts of money being fed into the financial sector. Most people, when you ask them, what caused the crisis, they'll say, well, Wall Street. Okay. Now you can place this in a larger perspective. Okay. To some extent, financialization is not the cause, it's the consequence. Okay. It's a consequence of a system that concentrated so much profit in the hands of the capitalist class that they were searching for profitable outlets. And there's a great book called Capitalizing on Crisis by Greta Krippner. And she talks about how there was a sustained political effort to create the conditions that allowed for the financial troubles to emerge. Glass-Steagall, okay? That's probably the most famous act, Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall was put in place after the Depression to keep a wall between commercial banking and investment banking. Do you want them investing on a casino with your money that's in a commercial bank? No. The capitalist class said, this is restricting the mobility, the free mobility of capital, which is so important in a free market. So they got rid of Glass-Steagall under Clinton. I think it was under Clinton. Okay. That allowed all of that money in those commercial banks to go into the exotic financial instruments that you've read so much about. And I don't want to get into all the details on that.
Bad Money by Kevin Phillips deals with this also. Specifically.
Bad Money. And by the way, Kevin Phillips is one of the most insightful in terms of predicting where things are going to go in the political economy. This is the guy that used to be a Republican consultant. And he saw the light. Okay. And he realized this system is unsustainable. And it has nothing to do with the traditional conservative values that he might have associated with Republicans in the past. Kevin Phillips. I wouldn't recommend any book. Is that the last book he's written?
No, that was 2005 he wrote it.
Okay. He saw this coming.
No, 2007.
Okay.
But he did, you're right.
He did see this coming. If you haven't seen Inside Job, you need to see it, okay? You might get the impression that it was just because of the financial thing that we had the... What I've done is I've tried to paint a much bigger picture so you understand why there was financialization in the first place. But what they do an excellent job of doing is they describe something called a securitization food chain. So if you're trying to like figure out, because it is complicated, how exactly did all these mortgages get translated into investment vehicles that then blew up, okay? They have a beautiful way of outlining this. And what you can do is if you just go to YouTube and type in Inside Job Securitization Food Chain, there's like a 5-minute video. So I can't explain it as well as them, but it's very interesting. And this entire documentary. Oh, I say gambling on the private debt of workers. You know, I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, sort of trying to make sense of it. Maybe somebody's already done this. But there's something utterly brilliant about the way this has worked. Think about it. You deprive workers of income. In order to survive, they have to take on debt. They have to borrow the money. You then take the profits you've made based on depriving them of income and you invest it in the instruments that is produced by the debt they're taking on. You see what's going on here? So you're basically betting, okay, investing, making money off of the debt that the workers have taken on because you didn't pay them enough money. Now I need to work this one out. Okay? But there's something here.
Pretty much like organized crime.
Yeah, it's like organized crime. Exactly. Thank you. All right. So financialization, financial profits as a percent of total domestic profits. So if all of this investment is going into the financial sector, how many jobs are really going to be created? How many people are going to find work? Forget about manufacturing. This is where the money was going. You had massive amounts of surplus profit. It had to be invested somewhere. They found a place for it. Okay. But of course, it couldn't sustain itself. So what I say is the very conditions, and this gets back to one of the assumptions I made at the beginning, the very conditions and strategies that prevented the onset of demand-side crisis, right? What I would have said is this demand-side crisis should have happened in the 1990s maybe, right? But it didn't because financialization and debt, right? And we've had one bubble. This has been supported by bubbles, right? Savings and loan. What was the next one? High tech bubble? Was that high tech? What did they call it?
.com.
Yeah, dot-com bubble, right? Okay? That collapsed, and then the housing bubble. Those other ones weren't so bad because they weren't based on something everyone owns, right? I mean, a lot of people didn't own stocks. Everyone owns a house, and they were using it as an ATM machine. So the gig was up. You could work many hours. You could have multiple paychecks. You can take out debt. None of that is available anymore, okay? That's all gone. The gig is up. There's no next thing to do to sustain demand, and there is no demand, or there's insufficient demand. Okay, so it's sort of like the longer you forestall the crisis, right, and put in place all of these ways to keep the system going, which is bubble after bubble after bubble, when the crisis comes, it's even bigger than it would have been otherwise, okay? Another contradiction, a paradox. Now this is a nice graph because I think it shows, it's actually a graph that supports this theory, okay? When capital is strong, okay, you would expect their income share to be high, right? So this is a graph of the United States top 100% income, top 1%, the top 1% population, their income share between 1913 and 2008. Notice it peaks here, okay? What happened after that? A demand-side crisis. Capital strong, labor weak, insufficient demand, demand-side crisis. Then we have the institutionalization of the New Deal and programs, progressive things, unions, higher taxes, progressive, and their percentage gets smaller and smaller until they get pissed off and they stop investing, and we have a supply-side crisis. Okay. And then you have the institutionalization of neoliberalism. Income inequality increases, it just reaches unbelievably high levels. This is a reflection of capital's strength, the strength of capital in relationship to labor. And what do we have? A demand-side crisis. Okay? Capital strong, labor is weak, demand-side crisis. Labor relatively strong, capital relatively weak, supply-side crisis, and then the other type here. Okay? As we went through the 80s and 90s under the neoliberal policies. The economic crisis will continue for a long time, I believe. I don't think there's any recovery in sight. And I just wrote a viewpoint piece for the Jacksonville Business Journal. They actually publish things I send them, even though it's a Jacksonville Business Journal. They're very ecumenical. Okay, the editor is great. He wants all different viewpoints. So I make many of these points. Why will the crisis continue? Well, it's a demand-side crisis. If it's a demand-side crisis, you don't institute austerity, right? Just read Paul Krugman's column, right? The guy is like, he can't speak anymore, he said it so many times, right? So the Keynesian and the Marxist, there's a little convergence here, at least in terms of what would be the policy to get us out. Of course, the Marxists would say, enough of this crap of up and down. Let's change the economy. Let's think about alternatives. And by the way, Obama's played into this very badly. Okay, he talks about deficits more than he talks about poverty. Okay. So, and the sequester, he's responsible for that. That turned out to be an austerity measure. Sequester is just a nice name for it. Okay. Fiscal cliff, austerity, okay? And it's not over yet. We've got persistent unemployment. If people are unemployed, depresses wages, people don't have money to spend, no demand, demand-side crisis continues. Declining wages, anti-labor, it's unbelievable in this climate, after labor has been beaten to death, that you would have legislation coming out of state houses. Think about Michigan, a right-to-work law in Michigan, the home of the United Auto Workers, and take a look at the kind of legislation that the Republican Party is trying to push through, and along with some of the Democrats, okay? I mean, they're all in it together. Trying to push through anti-labor legislation. Even under these, it's the worst thing they could do. Marx once said you could sell a capitalist
The
a rope to hang themselves, okay? And that's exactly what it is. The capitalist class wants more and more and more, but they don't realize they're getting deeper into it, and eventually people are going to get pissed off, okay? And it's going to happen sooner than later, I hope. Okay? What kind of work are people finding? Even when they come back into the labor market, it pays less and they're suffering downward mobility. Temp work has become very big. There's a contract work. There's a whole area of sociological study now on precarious work.
Adjuncts.
Very good. Adjuncts. Courtney, do something about that. You got it. Okay. Growing inequality. Student debt. There is now more student debt than credit card debt. Think about this. I'm writing something on this too. Maybe I'll send that to the folio. Okay? About what higher education has promised and what it hasn't delivered, who's making money off of this. It's a scandal. And when you have lots of young people unable to either find a job or make enough money to move out of their house, they move back in with their parents, you're talking about a massive depressing effect on the economy. Because this is a population, they graduate, they get a job, they buy a house, they buy all the shit that you put in a house, all the big box items. This is a huge stimulant. The unemployment rate has only gone down because people have left the labor market. discouraged workers. Right now, the labor force participation rate is the lowest it's been since 1979. So when people say we're having a recovery, no, the 1% is having a recovery. Corporate profits are very high. The stock market is back. Who gives a shit? Okay? It doesn't affect most people. So the recovery is not happening. All right, this is what I want to end on because I think this is very nice that Paul Krugman recognizes this, and I'll read it. This was his comment on how we understand the economic crisis. I think our eyes have been averted from the capital labor dimension of inequality. That's what this theory is about. It has echoes of old-fashioned Marxism, which shouldn't be a reason to ignore the facts, but often is. Krugman is not a Marxist. He's a Keynesian economist. But here he is looking at the data. He's a data-driven person. And what he's saying is what's going on here is about capital and labor, struggle, class war, inequality. Okay, thank you very much.